Hi, hi. Hi, I'm Carolyn Kellogg with the Los Angeles Times, and I'm here to talk to Michael Chabon, whose brand new novel, Telegraph Avenue, is out tomorrow. Mr. Chabon!
Hi. Just call me
Hi!
Michael.
Okay. Thank you for joining us to talk about your book.
Thank you. It's fun to be here. I've never done anything like this before, so I'm a little apprehensive.
Well, it's funny, we're using the technology of the future to talk about your book, which sort of has a bunch of the culture of the past. It's really
Right,
sad.
absolutely. That's
Um,
kind of a cool thing.
so let's talk first about what it was that I mean. I know the inspiration question is kind of dumb, but where did this book, which is about two guys who own a record store with jazz music, 70s, Oakland and Berkeley, where did it start?
Well, this it's always hard to sort of pick an initial moment, or it's often hard to pick an initial moment. It's especially hard in the case of this book. Um, you know, uh, I think the most superficially correct answer would be that it started when I had promised the TNT network in 1999 that I would try to come up with an idea for a television series for them. Were just trying to go into the series television business at that point, and I sort of casting around for different possible ideas, and at that point in the process walked into a used record store that was actually on Claremont Avenue, not on Telegraph Avenue here in Oakland. And on the day that I happened to walk into this record store, there were two guys working in the store. One was a black guy, one was a white guy, and they had a bunch of customers hanging out, and some of them were black and some of them were white, and they were talking about music and teasing each other and just goofing around. And I had that thought, wow, this could be maybe a good setting for a TV show. But more powerfully, and I think if that had been all of it, it wouldn't have led me all those many years later to try to write a book. What I really felt at that moment was a sense of kind of uh, return to, in a very microcosmic way, to the place that I grew up, which is maybe the truer answer to your question of where did this book start, because I grew up in a place called Columbia, Maryland. That was a planned community built in the countryside between Baltimore and Washington, D.C. when it was still countryside. Um, and it was racially integrated. It was designed to be a place where black people and white people would live together, and young couples of any race could afford to buy a nice house. And it was sort of like Levittown with a great society social agenda. And for the first 10 years that I lived in Columbia, Maryland, which were the first 10 years of its existence, it really did stick to its core principles fairly closely. And I grew up just surrounded by black people with black friends and black teachers, and a lot of black authority figures, and feeling that Black History Month, February, was my history month, and that Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass and people like that were my forebears. And I left that world. I left Columbia to go to college. I went to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and very quickly discovered that that had been a polder. That was this sort of like little magical oasis, and that the world wasn't really like that. And I moved very far afield from the world of Columbia, Maryland, and in a way that caused me a lot of pain. And it was when returning and stepping into that record store and just seeing those guys hanging out, where their shared passion for records had caused them to create this little polder of their own, that just reminded me in a way of everything I had lost, and made me want to try to reconnect it fictionally in some way.
And so it was TV show. People didn't really go for that. What's
Yeah, no, that
interesting,
didn't. I wrote a pilot. I wrote a script for a 2-hour pilot, and it didn't go. And I laid it aside. I've laid a lot of things aside over the years, including other proposed television series, and never gone back to them, and have no desire to go back to them. But with that one, I think partly because I love the characters that I had created so much, and I love the world, not just the record store, but the midwifery practice. I think, midwifery is just such amazingly powerful, fascinating, compelling work to do. It attracted me as a writer, just a challenge of trying to write about that kind of work. And but even more than that, the fact that I just continued to live in the proposed world of that show and walked out into it on a daily basis. And as I walked out, I would keep thinking, if I had done that show, I could have put that in there. Or I need to put a taco truck, or I would have been able to put all these other things into the show if only I had done it. And at some point, I just started thinking, well, why don't I just do it? I can do it myself. Screw to the networks. I'll just do my own fictional, prose version of that. And I stupidly thought it was going to be easy. I stupidly thought all I would have to do would be novelize the book, novelize the script, and turn it into a book, and it would probably take me a few months, maybe at most, to do that, since I had already done all the hard work. And that was idiotic. And in fact, after 2 years of trying to do that, fully 2 years of trying to do that, I was in despair, and I wanted to just abandon the project completely. But my wife, Ayala, talked me out of that, and she loved the characters too, and she just said, I really want to find out what happened to these people. You have to stick with it. And so I just went back to the drawing board and started all over again, started with a completely new story. It kept the core configuration of the characters and who they were, but just changed everything and started over, this time as a novel, conceiving it as a novel from the get-go.
So there's the 12-page sentence
Yes.
in the middle of the book. Did that come when you were in the middle of your writing, or was that one of the things that you used to jumpstart the process of this being a novel, not a TV show?
No. I had to go through all those years of trying to move it from its initial conception to being a full-fledged novel under sail before I would ever have had the impulse or felt the freedom or had the guts to try to do that. But initially, that chapter, it's one sentence long chapter. Initially, it was a problem-solving tool, in a sense. Like, I had this feeling, having come to the end of the first half of the book, of myself as a writer wanting to take stock of my characters and just say, okay, where are they all now? I had a lot of characters and a lot of moving parts, and I'm trying to keep track of them, and I had this, just writerly impulse of, like, where is everyone right at this moment? And then I had this thought of, like, well, if I could just do in a movie, I would do it as a tracking shot, like Robert Altman in The Player, or in Touch of Evil, one of these tracking shots where the camera could just sort of swoop and soar in and just go through windows, and here's where Nat and Aviva are, and here's where Archie is, and here's where Gwen is, and here's where Luther and Valletta, and here's Julie and Titus, and here's what everyone's doing. And then my next thought, just thinking like swooping and flying, I thought of like a bird's eye view of these characters, and then I thought of the parrot, and so I put the parrot and the idea of a single continuous unbroken shot, like a tracking shot, together, and what emerged was this idea of trying to just do it all in one sentence. And I didn't know how long that sentence needed to be. I just thought I would start writing it and go until I had checked in on each of the characters, however long that was. At some point I realized it was going to be long, and then I wanted to make it as long as I possibly could. At some point, sort of, I wanted to see just how I'd never written such a long sentence before. There were some of my favorite, the writers most important to me have written long sentences. So Joyce, of course, and Ulysses, and Faulkner and Proust, have all done really, really, really long sentences. And I thought, well, I'm gonna try it and see how well it works. And it was really, really fun. And I think that sentence to me is one of my best sentences that I've ever done. It was a challenge, and it made me really appreciate how both how important and how dangerous conjunctions can be.
A number of our readers asked about your writing process, so this might be an interesting way to sort of poke down into that. So you're writing this one sentence. Do you take a deep breath, sit down, and just start typing and not get up until you're done?
In that case, kind of, yes.
Really?
It's certainly the deep breath part. I remember sitting down and going like this and knowing I was going to start this long sentence and thinking, I'm going to start with the parrot. The parrot is my point of view character for this sentence. I think that was an important initial decision to try to make is this point of view going to be the godlike point of view of the omniscient author, or is it going to be somebody's point of view? And well, obviously it can't just be a human's point of view, because no human is capable of doing the things unless it's Superman or somebody, what I need the sentence to do. But this parrot can do it. I committed to the parrot. I had a precedent in my work because I have a parrot in my book, The Final Solution, African gray parrot. And in fact, in my mind, this is actually the same parrot. It's just 60 years later. Those are very long-lived birds. So it's the same bird. He's now in Oakland, California. And having decided to do it this way, I just began with that parrot in the first clause of the sentence and just went from there. And I was determined not to just say and, comma, and proceed in that way. I made from the very beginning, I wanted to be an honest sentence, not just a bunch of what could be individual sentences stuck together with commas or semicolons. At a certain point, I realized, if for the sake of clarity and for a kind of scenic unity, that I needed to I did have to separate big chunks of my sentence, and I use semicolons to do that, and I use semicolons at each point as we're sort of leaving one character behind and the parrot flies on and then checks in on the next set of characters or character. I use a semicolon there, but I did just go on. It took me 2 days, essentially. I got most of the way, I think I got all the way through in 1 day, and then I went back and realized that I had broken my rule here and there, and I tried to refine and make that sentence work better. And then I did go back, half dozen times subsequently over the course of rewriting the manuscript. But essentially, the work of it was done in 2 days.
You mentioned several different references there. I think there was Joyce and Faulkner and Altman and Touch of Evil, which is Orson Welles, and I think of Dickens, whose Bleak House begins with a tracking shot from the point of view of a bird.
Right.
Except there weren't tracking shots then. And one of the great joys of, I'm going to put this up again, Telegraph Avenue, is how much culture and intertextuality is just sort of packed in there without a lot of explanation, or you're not trying to belabor the fact that there are these references. It's just lively and full with them. Mm-hmm. Is that something that, was it important to this narrative to seed those things in there?
It just felt natural and inevitable. I mean, it's not just... Well, it's both. It's partly that it felt natural and inevitable, that my characters are very much themselves steeped in this kind of popular culture. Not just the men by any means. And Gwen, I think there might be a tendency to give Gwen a little bit of short shrift in terms of, or that the pop culture references in which she thinks and expresses herself are her own. She is herself like a Star Trek fan. She's a lifelong Star Trek fan. So she thinks of Star Trek when she thinks of the hormonal madness that has kind of overtaken her in this last stage of her pregnancy. She thinks of it in terms of the Pon farr, the Vulcan mating madness that Vulcans every 7 years. So it is them. And it's because they are who they are that they conceive of their world in these kind of terms. But it is all, I mean, it's also, I think it's a traditional, customary way of creating a piece of literature. At another era in literary history, it would have been Greek mythology, Roman mythology, biblical references, learned references to the classics and so on. Actually, I have a little bit of that in there too, but the canvas is much broader for me, and I would go to a Rush album as readily as to the Elder Edda or something like that. But
no Rush, more Star Trek.
And to me, they're all on the same par. I don't really distinguish among them. It's all culture to me. So I mean, the way that you make an object of literature is in part by referring to and drawing on influences and references to other works of literature. It's just my definition of literature is a little more Catholic.
So your last in your last book, Yiddish Policeman, you invented a world, and so the references could be whatever you wanted to make them. Was it interesting to switch gears to go from a world of your own invention, like this alternative history, back
well,
into
it
the
was
70s?
a little easier actually. It was harder in Yiddish Policemen's Union to to always have to sort of vet everything in a sense through the filter of the world that the parameters and the rules of the world that I was creating, and think, well, do they have Mickey Mouse, in this world? Okay, let's presume they do have Mickey Mouse. If Mickey Mouse cartoons were dubbed into Yiddish and shown in this on television when my main character was growing up, was he called Mickey Mouse, or did they make up a name like they do in a lot of other languages for Topolino or whatever it might be? And I had everything required being sort of put through that process. And I'd say, well, either I can use an actual real world reference but filter it, or make it up, as you say, and just completely invent some thing that only exists in this world. It was harder. It was everything about doing that. It's harder. It's a lot easier when you're basing the world that you're creating in consensus reality. But that being said, it's still every book for me is ultimately an act of world building. It starts with sort of kind of map making, and my beginnings of my wanting to be a writer all derived from my reading as a kid, and what I loved most were books that really immersed you into a dense, detailed fictional world, and frequently those books came with maps and on the end papers, and map making, cartography, and world building are all huge elements in the pleasure that I get from writing in the first place. So that writing this book, even though yes, it's set in Oakland and Berkeley, to me it's not Oakland and Berkeley. It's Brokeland. It's my version of it. And the map is not exactly the same map. And the block where Brokeland Records stands with the King of Bling, a gold rope store, and the United Federation of Donuts, and the Queen of Sheba Ethiopian restaurant across the street, there is no such block. It doesn't exist.
Oh.
It has analogs, but it only exists in the form of my book. And so to me, this is Middle Earth. To me, this is Prydain. This is any one of the sort of more better known literary imaginary worlds. It looks and feels and smells and sounds more like the world we're used to, but it's still completely imaginary.
So then how do you feel about Diesel Books in Oakland sort of converting to be Brokeland Records for a week?
It's so cool. I mean, I love Diesel Books. It's my big neighborhood bookstore my go-to neighborhood bookstore, and that the fact that they would be supporting the book in that way is really exciting. It makes me a little like when I drove past Diesel, which is now completely outfitted as Brokeland Records, it has this big sign saying Brokeland Records. First thing I had is, as a regular customer of Diesel, you have that panicked feeling of like, oh my God, what happened to Diesel? Like, what did they do to it? Then, then I remember, oh wait, okay, this is fine. This is just pretend. I've had this experience a little bit in other times when there was a proposed movie of Cavalier and Clay. They created, the producers of the film created some sets just sort of that you could walk through that were sort of to give the idea, and they created this set of where the guys in that book all gather in the beginning to have this marathon comic book creating jam session. And I walked through that set and had that same strange feeling of something that's utterly fictitious being translated into actual furniture and signage and all of that. And the same thing happened when I visited the set of Wonder Boys and walked into my character Grady Tripp's study, and it really did look exactly how I would have, how I had pictured it. It's a little bit disturbing. It's a little dreamlike. It's almost like a hallucination, like something that has only ever existed in here is suddenly in front of your very eyes. I mean, that is almost the definition of a hallucination in a sense. It ought to be, it ought to stay in here, but somehow it's escaped. If it's in front of you, it's strange.
As a writer who's written both for, I mean, you've won huge prizes for your novels, but you also have written directly for the screen. You've written for TV. You're working on an HBO project, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
Still, yes, no?
Yes, still working on that, yeah.
So how do you make the choices about, like, why do you cross the boundary? Why bother to invent the dream world if you can have the world inside the books?
Well, I love movies. I love television too. I mean, I love a lot of the great HBO series they've done. The Wire. You know, I can't imagine life without The Wire. The Sopranos. You know, those are works of art that mean a lot to me. I love movies too, and so I mean, yes, there's a financial element to it, and there always has been. As time has gone on, that financial element, while certainly welcome, has receded a little bit to just the desire to get better at doing that kind of work. I really wanted to become a good screenwriter to see if I could do it. I'm now working in television and trying to, you know, see if I can meet the mark that was set by those series I mentioned and many others. Breaking Bad is another example of a show that I just revere. You know, there's a challenge. There's an element of challenge to test my skill, but there's also just a pure desire to make myself something that I have loved, you know, in the hands of other artists, and just to see if I can do it, which is how it all began for me as writing too. You know, I love to read, and I suddenly realized I love to read so much, I wanted to try to make something myself that other people might read and enjoy, and it's just really the same impulse ultimately. It's just it's a lot more dangerous. It's put you in a much more vulnerable position in Hollywood, because it's much better if you can armor yourself in only doing it for the money. If you could only do it for the money, then you would be a lot more immune to the heartbreak and the disappointment. You know, I tried to hold myself to that standard for a long time, but I weakened and broke down and actually started really caring about it, which means they really have you by the short hairs.
Let me ask you, because I can't actually ask you about short hairs. One of our readers asked where your vocabulary comes from, where your fabulous, rich vocabulary comes from. Do you practice?
It comes from Taiwan. I have it shipped to me. I love words. I've always loved words since I was a kid. I have a good memory for words, and I you know, noticed them early on. I grew up in a family where words and wordplay were very valued. My father and my grandfather were both sort of inveterate punsters and interested in words and language, and you know, that it just was part of the package that I came with, that I pay attention to words and language, and I care about them. And so I store them up, I save them, I notice them. I know a lot of words. I don't see any reason to limit myself to a more conventional, sort of reduced lexicon, when there are so many amazing words in the English language that are kind of standing around waiting for somebody to notice them. And not only that, but I love it in other writers who do the same thing, you know, like Nabokov or David Foster Wallace, just to give two examples of writers who, you know, I feel like really push the lexicon, really push the vocabulary and open up their writing to all kinds of less familiar words. It's something I appreciate and respect them for, so it just comes naturally.
And in this book, you, again, switching gears a little bit, but I'm afraid we're going to run out of time. In this book, you make these leaps of imagination into characters who are that are African American. It's just African American communities, into the lives of midwives and a pregnant woman who's hormonal and kind of losing it sometimes, and actually giving birth. Like, what kind of boundaries frighten you, and which ones don't?
You know, I don't know. There are no boundaries that frighten me. I love boundaries. I'm drawn to boundaries. When I see a boundary, I want to cross it. Um, I I didn't know for certain that I would be able to necessarily do these things. And what, yes, absolutely, when it came time to write a scene of a woman giving birth and to be in her point of view as she does so, yes, I recognize there's a certain amount of imposture involved there, a certain amount of chutzpah involved in doing that. I'm okay with that. You know, it takes chutzpah and imposture to put yourself in anybody's point of view. I'm not trying to diminish the cultural legacy of you know, minstrelsy or of appropriation of by white artists of black points of view or anything like that. However, you know, I'm trapped in here from the moment I became a conscious human being. I've been stuck inside of this skull, and the things I value most in the world are the things that take me out of this and let me be inside someone else's mind, someone else's point of view. And for me, literature is the greatest, surest, most reliable means of doing that, or at least having the sense of doing that, both by being in contact with the mind of the author through the pages of the book, but also being inside those points of view as they are hopefully skillfully created by the author. You know, to create any point of view takes a leap. You have to imagine yourself out of your own mind and into the mind of another person. But that ultimately, to me, that's the leap we all ought to be making in our everyday dealings with other people. I mean, that's what empathy is. In order to be empathetic, you have to be able to make that imaginative leap and say to yourself, you know, what would I think if I were that person? What would I say? If I'm that person, how am I probably feeling right now? Or what am I probably thinking right now? To me, that's both the most basic and the highest form of what it means to be, you know, a human being. And I think it certainly would not be an imposture to try to imagine what a black person, for example, is thinking or feeling as I'm talking to them or dealing with them or you know, incorporating them into my life as a friend or whatever it might be. So why should it be in literature? I'm not sure. I know there's a long history to answer that question, but ultimately it boils down to a question of imagination.
I saw that in the back of the book you thanked a couple of people for being sort of experts in music or movies. So all that said about empathy and novels allowing us to live inside the brain of another consciousness almost, yours, the author, and these other characters that you've created. All that said, did you vet some of your cultural references?
You bet. I mean, I always do. I always do. I have since Cavalier and Clay. Really, I've you know, when I gave Cavalier and Clay, among other people, I gave it to people who had grown up in New York City during the period I was talking about. With Yiddish Policemen's Union, I gave it to someone who was a Yiddishist. I gave it to someone who was a chess expert. I gave it to someone who I talked to a policeman. With this book, I gave it to, I found, you know, black readers. I found readers who live in this area, somebody who grew up in this area. You know, I talked to midwives. I talked to people in record stores. I did a certain amount of due diligence trying to make sure I got it right. And I did make changes based on things that I heard in all of the cases of all those books. You know, Final Solution, I gave it to 2 British people to make sure I had the diction right and so on, and the phrasing, so that it was persuasively British. You know, and I made changes based on that. Yeah, I'm interested in getting it right, but ultimately, it is always just a question of your imagination.
There's so much. If I can ask you 2 more questions, one's a long one, one's a short one.
Okay.
There's so much about fatherhood and being a father, or resisting the pull of having to be a father, or wanting something from a father, but also the needs of sons. A lot of fathers and sons, and mothers as well. Is there something about being at this point in your life and career that allows you to see sort of both sides of?
Yes, I mean, in a way, I kind of change teams. When you have a child, you change teams, and so the example I always give is with Romeo and Juliet. Before you have children, you side with Romeo and Juliet, and you think the Montagues and the Capulets are idiots, and if they would have just gotten out of the way and let those two kids love each other, everything would have been fine. And then when you have kids, you start thinking, if they would just listen to their parents, none of this would have happened. I tended to write much more from the point of view of a son looking at a father before I had children of my own than I do now. And in one of my early short stories, I think only one, right at the very end, in one paragraph, I kind of make this leap that I did before I ever had kids, and to sort of looking from the father's point of view at his child. And I remember what a leap it felt like at the time. And it was really an exercise in, this story was partly autobiographical, and I was thinking, what was he thinking? What did he think of me then, and how did he see me? And given that I've made these changes within the context of this fictional short story, how would this father look at his son? And I can remember the effort involved in trying to do that, and that becomes effortless once you actually have children of your own. But I still have not forgotten, what it's like to be a son. I will say that having sons and daughters of my own has definitely made me more forgiving of my own father, in hindsight. And my own limitations as a father, even though I try as hard as I can to be a good father, those limitations are exposed on a daily basis, at least once a day, generally much more than that. And so having my own limitations exposed makes me much more forgiving of the limitations of my father, and of his father before him, and of my mother's father too, and of all the fathers that I had experience of. Most of them were doing the best they could, even if the best they could wasn't that great.
And so this was a reader question, but a question that I had as well reading the book. At what point did you decide to throw in State Senator Barack Obama into a Berkeley fundraiser?
Well, he worked his way into it very organically and just instantaneously. Most of the big decisions in writing a book, I think, tend to get made very quickly, instantaneously. And I said Archie and Nat played in a band. There was talk of them being in a band together. We had never actually seen them gigging together. I knew I wanted to have them gig. I thought, well, where would they do that? I always try to not go with my first thought. My first thought was a club or something. What's your next thought? Well, a wedding or a bar mitzvah, or maybe a fundraiser. And then I thought of Carrie fundraisers that I had gone to in the summer in the Berkeley Hills in the summer of 2004, and how there was often musical entertainment, and I thought, okay, they can play a Carrie fundraiser. And then I looked at my fictional calendar, and I'm like, it's late August 2004, so that's after the DNC of 2004. That means Barack Obama has already given his speech. And as soon as I thought of that speech, that amazing speech he gave, that first speech, red states, blue states speech, the United States speech, I just knew instantaneously he was right for this book. That he, both in his biography and in what he said in that speech in particular, in the vision that he articulated in that speech, is the vision of Brokeland. It is the vision of Columbia, Maryland, where I grew up. And at that instant, I realized it would actually be wrong not to have him in the book. That he belonged in this book, and so there he was. And then once I made that decision, it's not Barack Obama, it's Barack Obama, and the Barack Obama in quotes that we are talking about, that we know, that we see, that we read about, is in many respects a fictional character. I mean, he's part of a narrative that we kind of are ongoing in creating together, all together, and he's the protagonist of that narrative. So, people keep talking about a cameo appearance by by Obama in my book, but I don't see it that way. To me, it's a crossover. It's much more of a crossover appearance, like when Colonel Klink was on Batman, or when Munch from Homicide was on, you know, whatever it was,
CSI or one of those, yeah.
Exactly. You know, this is a crossover appearance of the character Barack Obama from his narrative into mine.
There's so much to talk about with this book. I think you're coming to Los Angeles to talk about it. That's
I am.
right?
I'm going to be at the Hammer. Yeah, I'm looking forward to that.
And that's this Thursday at 7:30?
That's correct. And I'll be appearing with, I Yell at Waldman's going to be my onstage companion for that.
Your interlocutor?
Yes, exactly. Which is her custom role, so and vice versa. So it's going to be great.
Well, I hope I'll be able to make it, and I hope you will too. And Michael Chabon, thank you so much for joining us here at the Los Angeles Times book video chat.
Thank you.
Thanks.
It's been really fun. Bye, Carolyn.
Bye.